You're often told that healing will soften you, that it will make you kinder, calmer, more patient, more agreeable, easier to be around, a better, brighter version of yourself. And most people accept this story because it sounds reassuring, harmless, and socially approved. In a culture that prizes likability, healing is marketed as becoming more palatable. But Carl Jung identified something that completely disrupts this comforting narrative. A healed empath does not become sweeter. They become dangerous, not dangerous in a violent or cruel sense, and certainly not to innocent people. They become dangerous specifically to those who once benefited from their self-sacrifice, those who relied on their endless understanding, their emotional flexibility, their habit of forgiving without limits. Dangerous to anyone who mistook their empathy for availability. Dangerous enough to unsettle people who once felt safe exploiting their softness. Jung believed that one of the most surprising and least understood shifts in human psychology occurs when an empath integrates the shadow. When they cross the internal threshold from being a wounded healer to becoming a whole person, something irreversible happens. They don't just improve, they become untouchable. And that is exactly what unsettles manipulators, narcissists, and emotional predators. Because what they fear most is not aggression, but immunity. To understand who the healed empath becomes, you first have to understand who the unhealed empath was. The unhealed empath lives as what Jung might describe as an emotional shock absorber, a human buffer designed to absorb impact so others don't have to. They take on tension, conflict, and unspoken pain, smoothing out emotional chaos for everyone around them, often at enormous personal cost. These are people who spent years absorbing other people's storms, an alcoholic father's volatility, a mother's slow, heavy depression that filled the house without a word being spoken, a partner's betrayal sensed long before it was ever confessed. Workplace envy disguised as concern, criticism wrapped in jokes, control masked as love. In American culture especially, these traits are often praised early on. You're called mature for your age, empathetic, a good listener, the strong one. What isn't acknowledged is the quiet self-erasure happening underneath. The empath learns that harmony is maintained by their own emotional compression, and that their needs are negotiable, optional, or invisible. Healing doesn't make that person nicer. Healing gives them boundaries, clarity, and gravity. And once that happens, the people who depended on their self-neglect feel exposed. You carried all of this not because you chose to, but because your nervous system was calibrated to notice every emotional shift around you. Jung described this as unconscious participation, a state in which you don't simply experience your own emotions, but involuntarily absorb the inner lives of others, their unspoken grief, their denied anger, their unresolved trauma quietly migrated into you, as if you were a holding container for what they refused to face themselves. And strangely, the pain wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was believing this was normal, believing this was your role. You came to see your sensitivity as a responsibility. Because you felt more, you assumed you were meant to manage more, to stabilize, to repair, to translate emotions for people who didn't have the language or courage to do it themselves. Over time, this became your identity. You were the reliable one, the listener, the emotional first responder, the person who could sit with discomfort so others wouldn't have to. What no one told you was this: while you were busy carrying everyone else's inner darkness, you were steadily abandoning your own inner life. And that is where the real danger began, not to others, but to you. Boundaries felt harsh, limits felt selfish, self-protection felt like betrayal. You agreed when every instinct in your body was saying no. You stayed calm on the outside while something inside you was breaking. You remained in environments and relationships long after your nervous system had been signaling distress. This erosion didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, quietly, in ways that were easy to rationalize, so slowly that you missed the most critical consequence. You vanished. Your authentic self was buried beneath layers of other people's unresolved emotions, fear that wasn't yours, anger you didn't create, shame you inherited through proximity. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly in his work. Empaths didn't come to analysis because they were disordered. They came because they were overwhelmed, submerged in a psychological environment that didn't belong to them. In his clinical observations, a familiar profile emerged, not a single person, but a composite. Someone he would describe as an introverted, intuitive type. A person who could enter a room and instantly sense the undercurrents, who was withholding the truth, who was hurting behind politeness, where resentment was buried, where aggression was being suppressed beneath civility. In theory, this should have been a gift. In reality, it was exhausting. You couldn't tolerate empty conversation because you felt the anxiety and self-deception beneath it. You couldn't sustain shallow connections because people felt uneasy around you. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because you perceived what others worked hard not to see. Around you, masks slipped, defenses weakened, and that made people uncomfortable. In a culture that rewards performance and surface-level optimism, depth is often mistaken for intensity, and intensity is often rejected. Jung came to a crucial realization. He wasn't treating mental illness. He was witnessing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception sharpens to a degree that disrupts ordinary social functioning. In empathic individuals, this pattern appears again and again. The capacity to perceive everything, the subtext, the contradictions, the emotional residue, eventually becomes the very thing that separates you from others. Seeing too much is not socially rewarded. It's isolating. But Jung also noticed that this state does not remain static. Eventually, something happens that alters the entire trajectory of a person's inner life. He referred to it as a turning point. Though that phrase barely touches the reality, this is not a collapse, it is a breakthrough that initially feels like devastation. Most often the trigger is betrayal. Not the minor kind that can be rationalized or minimized, but the kind that strips away denial completely. It comes from the person you trusted most, the one you defended when others questioned them, the one you made excuses for, the one whose pain you carried for years as if it were your own. And then the truth surfaces, not a single lie, but a pattern, not a misunderstanding, but a long-standing deception. Or you finally see how someone could harm you while maintaining a public image of goodness. Or worse, you realize they never related to you as a person at all, only as a function, a resource, a container, a source of emotional fuel. In that moment, something critical shifts. You don't fall apart. You wake up. This is where Jung's insight reframes the entire experience. The turning point is not the moment the empath loses it. It's the moment they finally begin to trust their own perception. Because all those years you spent absorbing other people's emotions, you were doing something else at the same time. Quietly, almost invisibly. You were watching, learning, mapping patterns. You were studying human behavior with the accuracy of someone who had no choice but to pay attention. Every micro-expression, every subtle shift in tone, every inconsistency between what someone said and what they radiated. In American culture, this kind of awareness is often dismissed as overthinking or being too sensitive. But what Jung recognized is that this sensitivity was never weakness. It was untrained intelligence. And when betrayal removes the final layer of self-doubt, that intelligence consolidates. The empath stops explaining reality away, stops gaslighting themselves, stops outsourcing their trust. And from that moment forward, their awareness is no longer unconscious. It becomes deliberate. That is when everything changes. You perceived everything effortlessly, without trying, without strategy, almost reflexively. You understood far more than you ever admitted to yourself. Not because the insight wasn't there, but because you refused to weaponize it. You restrained yourself. You chose not to act on what you saw. This pattern shows up again and again in the transformation accounts Jung documented. The awakening is rarely dramatic. There's no explosion, no confrontation, no speech. It arrives as something far quieter and far more irreversible. Clarity. The empath who spent decades second-guessing themselves simply stops. The inner knowing you muted for years, out of a desire to keep peace, preserve relationships, avoid conflict, suddenly outweighs every external voice telling you that you're imagining things, being too sensitive, or reading too much into it. You stop debating yourself. You stop asking for confirmation. You stop needing permission to trust your own perception. What emerges is what Jung described as a psychologically whole personality, someone who has integrated the shadow. And it's essential to understand this clearly. The shadow is not malice or cruelty. The shadow is everything you were trained to suppress in order to remain acceptable. Your intelligence when it made others uneasy, your anger when it was labeled inappropriate or excessive, your ability to say no without explaining yourself, your willingness to let people experience the consequences of their own choices, your capacity to walk away quietly without defending yourself or seeking closure, your skill at recognizing manipulation in real time before it even fully forms into language. None of these qualities are new, they are reclaimed, and as integration deepens, something important happens. You don't become harsher, you become more exact. Not colder, but more lucid, not dangerous to the world, but unreachable to those who relied on your self-erasure. Each phase of this transformation feels stronger than the last, because your energy is no longer being spent on containment, on shrinking yourself, on managing other people's discomfort, on arguing against your own instincts. For the first time, your strength is working for you instead of against you. And that changes everything. Stage 1, the mirror effect. At this stage, the healed empath stops absorbing other people's emotional material. They are no longer a sponge. Instead, they become a mirror, but not the kind that distorts the image to protect feelings or soften reality out of politeness. This mirror reflects exactly what is present. No commentary, no justification, no emotional cushioning. To understand why this is so destabilizing, imagine a familiar psychological dynamic. For years, a person with strong narcissistic tendencies relies on empaths as emotional offloading stations. Cruel remarks are delivered. The empath absorbs the impact. Insecurities are projected. The empath internalizes responsibility. Shame, anger, and anxiety are dumped freely, allowing the narcissistic person to walk away lighter, calmer, and unburdened. That system functions smoothly until it encounters a healed empath. Suddenly, the old tactics stop working. Guilt no longer hooks. Gaslighting no longer creates confusion. Subtle humiliations disguised as concern fall flat. Passive aggression receives no emotional return. Instead of reacting, the healed empath simply observes. They don't defend, they don't explain, they don't counterattack, they look. And in that steady presence, something deeply uncomfortable happens. The other person is forced to see themselves, not the curated version they present socially, but the unfiltered one beneath it. Insecure, internally hollow, driven by control, dependent on manipulation for stability. The very self-image they've spent a lifetime avoiding. That confrontation is intolerable. What's important to understand is this: the healed empath isn't judging. They aren't shaming. They aren't exposing or retaliating. They're simply holding the reflection. And because the other person cannot tolerate what they see, they do what psychologically unconscious people often do when confronted with reality. They attack the mirror. The empath is suddenly labeled cold, selfish, different, too distant, too harsh. You've changed. These accusations aren't observations, they're defenses, attempts to reassert control by destabilizing the reflection. But the healed empath recognizes the pattern instantly. They've lived it too many times, and now they no longer engage. This is why the mirror effect is so threatening to manipulators. It removes their most effective weapon, your self-doubt. The healed empath trusts their perception fully. That quiet, grounded certainty becomes disarming to anyone who survives by bending reality. Carl Jung documented this repeatedly in his clinical work. When empaths stopped questioning their intuition, they became largely immune to the strategies that once controlled them. Gaslighting loses its power when reality is no longer negotiable. Guilt collapses when shame is returned to its rightful owner. Control disappears when there is no internal agreement to be treated as an object, and this is only the beginning. The mirror effect is merely the first stage of the transformation. Stage 2, selective empathy. This is the stage that confuses people the most. From the outside, others expect one of two outcomes. Either you remain endlessly open the way you used to be, or you shut down completely and become emotionally unavailable. Neither happens. Something far more developed emerges. The unhealed empath functioned like an open door. Anyone could walk in, any emotion, any demand, any crisis. The door stayed open because closing it felt heartless. Saying no felt like a moral failure. The healed empath turns that open door into a threshold. And standing at that threshold is something new, discernment, not cruelty, not indifference, just an uncompromising commitment to protecting one's inner life. This is where selective empathy begins. You don't lose your capacity for compassion. You don't become numb. You can still sit with real grief, real struggle, real human pain. But now, empathy is intentional. You choose who has access to you. You choose which relationships receive your energy. You decide when engagement is appropriate and when distance is necessary. And you make these decisions without guilt, without over-explaining, and without apologizing for existing. To people who live with integrity, who respect boundaries, take responsibility for their behavior, and do their own emotional work, the healed empath feels deeply safe, attentive, present, grounding. There is warmth there. But to manipulators, chronic victims, and those who outsource their inner work to others, the healed empath feels unreachable. Performative tears no longer work. Rage meant to intimidate gets no traction. Stories designed solely to extract sympathy fall flat. This is where many people misunderstand the change. They call it coldness. In reality, it's the transition from nice to kind. Nice avoids discomfort. Nice maintains appearances. Nice sacrifices the self to keep the peace. Kindness, on the other hand, does what is genuinely helpful, even when it disrupts illusions, even when it creates tension. Kindness allows consequences. Kindness refuses to enable dysfunction. The healed empath stops being nice and becomes truly kind. Kind enough to say no without justification. Kind enough to stop rescuing people from their own choices. Kind enough to withdraw energy where it is being misused. What gives this stage its real power is that selectivity isn't driven by judgment or bitterness. It's driven by pattern recognition. You've seen how certain dynamics unfold. You recognize where manipulation leads. You can anticipate outcomes not because you're cynical, but because you're observant. Carl Jung described this as the result of differentiated consciousness, a state where compassion is no longer confused with self-erasure. At this level, sincerity doesn't require months or years to evaluate. A handful of interactions is enough, not through mysticism or guesswork, but through accumulated data stored quietly in the psyche over a lifetime. This is why the healed empath moves with such calm certainty. They are no longer guessing, they are reading patterns. And this inevitably leads to the next stage, one that others find even more unsettling. Stage 3, Strategic omniscience. This is the stage that truly unsettles people when they understand what they're witnessing. The healed empath develops a capacity most people never consciously acquire, an extraordinary sensitivity to deception, not through mysticism or intuition as magic, but through long-term survival conditioning. Consider what happens when someone grows up, or lives for years, in a state of constant vigilance. When emotional and sometimes physical safety depends on reading subtle cues accurately, when a slight change in tone can signal danger, when misreading a room carries real consequences. In those conditions, the nervous system doesn't just become empathic, it becomes analytical. The brain adapts. Carl Jung observed this repeatedly in his work. Empathic individuals were often able to predict behavioral outcomes with unsettling precision, not because they could see the future, but because they had spent decades unconsciously collecting and processing data. Human behavior became a language they learned fluently without ever intending to. Every interaction became information. Every conversation added a data point. Every relationship turned into a case study in motive, consistency, and outcome. The unhealed empath gathered all of this, but prohibited themselves from using it. They felt guilty for their clarity. They mislabeled intuition as judgment. They overrode internal warning signals because doing so felt more compassionate, more understanding, more morally upright. The healed empath stops doing that. After integration, they fully trust their internal database. When their nervous system signals deception, they don't wait for external proof. They don't need consensus. They don't argue their case. They recognize the pattern, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. They've already seen this sequence play out. They've registered the micro-expressions that precede an outburst, the vocal shifts that signal dishonesty, the behavioral rhythms that reliably end in betrayal or control. None of this is new information. What's new is access. Once the shadow is integrated, this knowledge moves from the unconscious into conscious awareness. The healed empath doesn't confront, accuse, or dramatize. They simply disengage from the game before it begins. This is why the stage feels so threatening to others. You can't manipulate someone who sees the pattern forming before the first move is made. You can't gaslight someone who no longer doubts their own perception. And you can't control someone who quietly steps out of reach without explanation. What looks like omniscience from the outside is actually something far simpler and far more earned. It's pattern recognition, finally trusted. Someone sits across from you, smiling. Within half a minute, you already know. You know they're lying about where they were last night. You know a favor is coming, and that it won't be returned. You know the setup has already begun, not because you're psychic, because you've watched this same script unfold hundreds of times. This is what makes this stage unsettling to others. You don't react. You don't confront. You don't expose or argue. You simply withdraw participation. And for people who rely on distorting reality to stay in control, that feels like the ground giving way beneath them. Micro-expressions don't lie. Patterns don't lie. Consistent behavior doesn't lie. This is what Carl Jung meant by differentiated perception. The healed empath doesn't just feel more. They process emotional and psychological information at a level most people never develop. They see structures instead of isolated moments, systems instead of moods, trajectories instead of single actions. Years of tension, pain, and vigilance didn't disappear. They reorganized. What once kept you on edge now functions as an internal framework, operating almost like an additional sense. Not mystical, adaptive, intelligence that passed through the nervous system and became refined. And here's the crucial turn. The healed empath understands manipulation completely. In fact, they could manipulate more subtly and more effectively than most narcissistic personalities. They know which insecurities to touch, which fears to activate, which words would land hardest, and exactly when to use them. They have the map, they have the skill, they have the leverage, but this is where real integration reveals itself. They choose not to use that power destructively. Jung was deeply interested in why some people, after integrating the shadow, retained their integrity, while others weaponized their insight. His conclusion was neither flattering nor mystical. The difference wasn't trauma, intelligence, or spiritual beliefs. It was conscious choice. The healed empath who remains whole makes a daily decision to act ethically. They see how easily manipulation could work. They recognize the unfair advantage their psychological clarity provides, and they refuse to exploit it, not because they lack the ability, but because they possess the restraint. This is strength, not passivity. Strength enough to influence without deception. Strength enough to tell the truth when lying would be more effective. Strength enough to walk away from games they could easily win. As Jung emphasized, it's easy to be good when you're incapable of harm. The higher level of development is having the capacity to do harm and choosing integrity anyway. That choice is what completes the transformation. This is individuation, the integration of light and shadow, the capacity to hold deep compassion alongside precise discernment. Softness when softness serves, firmness when firmness is required. This is the real strength of the healed empath. They no longer defend themselves. They no longer explain their boundaries. They no longer try to persuade anyone of their worth. Instead, they observe. They allow people to reveal who they are through behavior, consistency, and reaction. And then they choose accordingly, not out of bitterness, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. They stop arguing with reality. They start reading it. This is what Carl Jung referred to as conscious participation in life. The healed empath meets the world as it actually is, not as they wish it could be. They see people clearly, without fantasy or projection. They accept others as they are, and make relational decisions based on that clarity. There is no more attachment to potential, no more hope that love will redeem dysfunction, no more self-sacrifice for relationships that deplete rather than sustain. Paradoxically, this is what makes the healed empath capable of deeper love than ever before. They are no longer afraid of loss. They understand that anything misaligned with their truth can be released, quietly, cleanly, without drama, without needing validation or understanding. That inner freedom has a powerful effect. It draws psychologically mature people closer and naturally repels those who thrive on chaos, dependency, or control. Jung described this outcome as a form of psychological alchemy, the transformation of the wounded healer into the wise one, someone who descended into darkness, integrated what they found there, and returned not with bitterness or sermons, but with presence, not with accusations, but with example. The final insight Jung arrived at is simple and profound. The healed empath's greatest gift is not that they no longer feel pain. It is that they demonstrate what integration looks like in real life, that you can feel deeply and still have boundaries, see humanity clearly and still choose compassion, possess strength without aggression, clarity without cruelty. That calm, unforced, unreactive, grounded, is the quietest form of power there is, and it doesn't announce itself, it simply is. Your sensitivity was never a flaw, it was raw material. Every moment of pain, every betrayal, every loss wasn't random or wasted. You weren't falling apart. You were accumulating information, training perception, sharpening discernment, developing the internal capacities required to one day become psychologically untouchable. The goal was never to become less sensitive. The goal was to become consciously sensitive, to unite empathy with wisdom, intuition with self-trust, emotional depth with firm boundaries, to evolve from an emotional shock absorber into a deliberate, grounded force. This is individuation, not perfection, not emotional invincibility, but wholeness. a person who claims every part of themselves, light and shadow, tenderness and resolve, compassion and the capacity to walk away without hesitation. You are not too much for this world. You are precisely what a more mature level of consciousness requires. Someone who can witness darkness without being consumed by it, love deeply without self-erasure, see through illusion without losing hope. The unhealed empath asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The healed empath understands it happened to shape you into someone who cannot be manipulated, shamed, or pulled back into dysfunctional dynamics. You were never meant to rescue everyone. You were meant to rescue yourself, and in doing so, to become a living example of integrated empathy, not martyrdom, not chronic self-sacrifice, but conscious choice, strategic compassion, presence with boundaries. This is the transformation Carl Jung documented, and the one most frequently misunderstood. Healing does not mean returning to who you were before the pain. That version of you lacked awareness. The healed version is stronger because it is awake, integrated, and self-directed. This wholeness makes you dangerous only to those who mistook kindness for weakness, to those who believed empathy was something they could exploit, to those who relied on your self-doubt to maintain control. They experience a rude awakening. Because the healed empath does not argue, defend, or try to prove anything, they recognize the game, they understand the pattern, and they choose, often to leave so quietly the absence is felt before it's noticed. No confrontation, no explanations, no residue. This is who the healed empath becomes. Not nicer, not softer, but sovereign, centered, steady in their knowing, unshakable in their boundaries. They become love with a spine, compassion guided by discernment, empathy anchored in self-respect, and that combination, felt, clear, ethical, and free, is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. The healed empath comes to understand something many people spend a lifetime resisting. Protecting your peace is not selfish, it is sacred. Walking away from toxicity is not failure, it is growth. Choosing yourself is not cruelty, it is necessity. And the moment that choice is made, reality begins to reorganize. The people who drained you fade out of your life. The situations that once exhausted you stop repeating. The chaos that seemed to follow you everywhere can no longer locate you, not because you're hiding, but because you've changed levels. You're no longer operating in the same psychological terrain. You move beyond reach of unconscious behavior. Manipulation no longer lands. Guilt has nowhere to attach. Not because you hardened, but because you stepped out of the patterns that sustained it. This is the true strength of the healed empath. Not feeling everything indiscriminately, but choosing what is worthy of emotional investment. Not helping everyone, but offering presence only to those who take responsibility for their own inner work. Not endless patience, but the wisdom to recognize when patience turns into enablement. If you recognize yourself in this process, you already understand what's happening. You aren't losing people, you're leaving systems where your sensitivity was used against you. This is the shift Carl Jung described, the movement from unconscious repetition to conscious participation in life, from reaction to choice, from survival to wholeness. What felt like your breaking point was never destruction, it was initiation. Your sensitivity is not fragility, it is a finely tuned instrument. Your empathy is not a liability, it is power. And now that you know how to use it deliberately, you are no longer obligated to be convenient, endlessly understanding, or emotionally available to everyone who asks. You become who you were always meant to be. Calm, sovereign, integrated. And in this state, you don't argue for your strength. You don't prove it. You simply live it. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to The Great Wisdom. Thank you for watching.